Ladies and gentlemen, my name's Paul, and in this RetroGamingTech.com video, we're going to be doing a bit of a fun and silly video. We're going to test what happens if you are running a GTX 1080 class of graphics card and upgrade your CPU from an i7-8700K to an i9-9900K, albeit clocked at 5 GHz. There's a couple of reasons we're doing this, the first of which is that I figure it would be an interesting experiment, and I already have the 8700K with GTX 1080 results. And since I'm doing core count scaling testing for the 9900K and I'm doing it with a couple of different GPUs, I figure that this will be an interesting comparison. And the second reason is that I frequently get people writing to me asking for buying advice and asking, well, I don't really have enough money right now to upgrade both my CPU and GPU, so I want to do the platform upgrade first, so will I get any frames per second advantage in the short term? So the testing methodology here is really simple. We run an 8700K with 4.3 GHz, or in other words the default clock frequency, and we are testing it against the i9-9900K at 5 GHz. Now clearly the 8700K can be overclocked as well, and in many cases you can get 5 GHz, particularly if you're doing like lapping of the CPU and you're running with a decent AIO and you're lucky on the Silicon Lottery and so on, but I wanted to test with worst case scenarios. So you're running with a base frequency 8700K versus the kind of best case scenario of the 9900K, although it is worth noting quite the number of people do get, of course, the 9900K at 5.1 GHz or 5.2 GHz or what have you. I'd like to thank Intel for sending over the i9-9900K as a review sample, so that's on loan, so thanks very much to them, as well as MSI for providing the Z390 Gaming Pro Carbon motherboard, and also Deepcool for providing the AIO. A quick note about the game selection: I've decided to choose several older games and also pair them with a couple of newer games, including Control. The reason behind that is that I figure that slightly older games will be more CPU bound versus GPU bound, so that to me was the methodology there. But as we can see, there's not that much of a difference anyway. But enough talking, let's have a look at the benchmarks. Let's start things out with Assassin's Creed Origins. Just as a quick reminder, the i7-8700K is locked at 4.3 GHz for its 6 cores, whereas the i9-9900K is overclocked slightly to 5 GHz. And Assassin's Creed Origins is running at the highest quality settings. This game is very GPU demanding and uses DirectX 11. And even so, the 8700K is just 4 frames per second slower at 1080p, and there's almost margin of error difference between the 1440p and 4K results. I say almost margin of error because I did conduct these tests a couple of times and I got exactly identical results each time I ran it, so obviously the 9900K does have a slight advantage, but I wouldn't exactly say that it is going to be a startling difference. And next up is Batman Arkham Knight, once again at the highest quality settings, with the only difference being that I have disabled interactive smoke and debris and hardware physics because it beats the GPU with a stick. And 10 frames per second separates the 1080p and 1440p results with the i9-9900K and 8700K. And as for 4K, we have a 5 frames per second advantage for the 9900K. This game, when it came out, really loved GPU VRAM. You would find quite frequently that you would get stuttering on cards that had 6 GB of VRAM or less, and 8 GB was definitely the way to go. And as for CPUs, a fast clocked CPU is definitely advised, and well, now it's pretty easy to run the game. But yeah, the 9900K has a slight advantage, but certainly not anything to write home about. Rise of the Tomb Raider is next. I've opted for Rise of the Tomb Raider in DX12 mode, but with the high quality preset. The idea here is that DX12 in theory should leverage more CPU cores, and with high it also pummels the GPU less. And also we're using Rise of the Tomb Raider rather than Shadow of the Tomb Raider because Rise of the Tomb Raider is slightly less demanding. And in theory this should give the 9900K a slight edge. Does it? Well, judge for yourself. 160 FPS versus 155 essentially, and the 1440p result you have 102 versus 98, and the 4K result is 50 versus 55. It's potentially possible because I did do a driver update. This was actually one of the last games I tested, and I did do a drive update as I decided to throw this in last minute. So that might be the reason that the 4K results are slightly higher than what you might expect, but honestly it could also just be pure margin of error, and well, yeah, just a few frames per second. So I'm going to say that it's certainly faster with the 9900K, but it's once again not going to be a startling difference. Hitman 2016, and well, basically what I said about Rise of the Tomb Raider could be echoed here. DX12 mode again, this time we've decided to run at the highest quality settings, and the 9900K at 1080p has the largest advantage over the 8700K, but to say larger advantage would be disingenuous. It's just a 4 frames per second gap between them, and at 4K it shrivels to way less than 1 frame per second, about a quarter of a frame per second to be exact. And now Gears of War 4. Gears of War 4 is definitely a game which does pummel the GPU, but at 1080p there is a 4 frames per second gap between the 8700 and 9900K, and at 4K the GTX 1080 is just completely and utterly holding back performance, and it can't quite manage to hit 60 FPS without dynamic resolution enabled. The highest quality preset was chosen here, so we get 59.3, and the 8700K manages essentially 58 frames per second. I also decided to throw in a couple of newer titles as well. Next up is Gears 5 with the maximum preset selected at 1440p, although I have disabled dynamic resolution and minimum frame rate. So this basically means that if the frame rate dips below a certain threshold, if you have a minimum frame rate selected, you will have the game render at a lower resolution. So for example, it might render at, I don't know, 1300p if you have 1440p. To maintain the 60 FPS average, but for testing purposes I've disabled that because we want to see what happens when we push the GTX 1080 to the max. Do you get still a frame rate advantage with the 9900K? And the answer is no. To be totally blunt, you get 0 FPS advantage. The average and minimum frame rate is essentially identical between both processors. And finally, Control. Manual run-through of the early portion of the game at 1080p with the highest preset, but obviously because we're using Pascal, features like DLSS and shiny stuff, aka ray tracing, is not available to us. We are running DirectX 12 mode, of course, although we have enabled MSAA times 4. So with 1080p, Control is still extremely GPU demanding, and the minimum and average frame rate is identical across both CPUs as a result. Basically, the GTX 1080 here is just about managing to maintain 60 FPS at 1080p with MSAA times 4, and at Gears with 1440p, 60 FPS is achievable, but it's, you know, just about managing it on really heavy firefight situations. So what conclusions can we draw from looking at the results here? Well, if you couldn't tell by now, if you are running a GTX 1080 class of graphics cards, that would be also, let's say, an RTX 2060 Super, a Vega 64, and so on and so on, you're not going to get a major boost in gaming performance from the shift from an 8700 to a 9900K. But there are some instances where it may be worth doing the platform upgrade anyway, even if you can't afford to buy the GPU simultaneously. For example, if you're a streamer, then upgrading to a higher core count CPU, whether it's the 9900K or one of the 3rd generation Ryzen CPUs, or for example, if you're doing video encoding as well and gaming is just like something you do on the side as well as doing some work, then definitely the shift to a new CPU and platform could be worth it, even if you can't afford to upgrade the GPU at the same time. Also, if you're running a lower resolution monitor, let's say you're running a 1080p screen, then it may not be worth upgrading the GPU anyway. But if you are playing a very GPU demanding title, for example Control, with all of the bells and whistles on, even lower resolutions can really hammer the GTX 1080. The GTX 1080, just so I'm clear, is still an amazing card, and quite frankly, given the age of the thing, it's still amazing what it can do with modern titles. But it is getting to the point where modern titles such as Control can really hammer the GPU, so you may need to make some sacrifices for visual quality. But in terms of CPUs anyway, I would personally say that if you can't afford to upgrade your graphics card and you only game, then it's probably not worth upgrading the CPU. In fact, in a separate video, I was also testing an i7 4770K, and it's actually remarkable how well a 4770K does hold up in 2019. I'll try to remember to link that in the description of that video. I will say, however, just so that you don't accuse me of clickbait with that, there are a couple of caveats with the 4770K. The first of which is that you will need pretty nippy memory, pretty fast memory, and also ideally you would want to clock the 4770K somewhere in the neighborhood of 4.3, 4.4 gigahertz, and with the faster memory combined with that, it can hang with more modern CPUs, obviously with still lower minimum frame rates than, let's say, a 3700X from AMD or an i9 9900K from Intel would achieve, but even so, it does do an admirable job. But do stick with us here at RGT if you want more fun videos such as this and also some more serious projects. I am still working on the core count scaling stuff. It's turning out to be a much bigger project than what I originally anticipated because I decided to throw in a lot more games, but it is coming, as well as DX12 testing versus DX11 and much more besides. But take care of yourselves. I hope you have an amazing day. Bye for now.